David Caldwell has everything, a successful tech empire, wealth, and the life most can only dream of. But when a mysterious clause in his late father's will threatens to strip away everything he's built, David's world begins to unravel. Who is the undisclosed party set to inherit part of his company? And why did his father keep this secret buried for so long? Dive into beneath the surface and unravel the mystery. But beware, nothing is as it seems. Chapter 1, The Fall. David Caldwell stood at the large windows of his penthouse, watching the city skyline shimmer against the darkening sky. New York had a way of making everything seem bigger, more glamorous. From up here, the problems of the world seemed small, insignificant. At least, that was the illusion he had sold himself for years. Behind him, the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the space. Emily was hosting another one of her extravagant dinner parties, and the living room was packed with Manhattan's elite. Business moguls, politicians, celebrities, everyone wanted a piece of the Caldwells. But even with all these people filling his home, David had never felt more alone. He took a deep breath and turned his back on the view, facing the room. Emily moved gracefully through the crowd, her smile as polished as her appearance. She looked stunning in her emerald green dress, but there was a distance in her eyes. They hadn't connected in months, maybe longer. When she saw him watching her, her smile faltered for just a second, then she turned back to her guests, laughing at something someone said. David's hand tightened around his glass of bourbon. He couldn't quite put his finger on when things had started to change between them. Their marriage, once filled with passion and excitement, had grown cold, transactional. He was the CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, a tech giant that had redefined industries, and she was the perfect trophy wife, hosting parties, attending galas, smiling for the cameras. But behind closed doors, it was all falling apart. The buzzing of his phone pulled him out of his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen, an email from Donovan, Associates, his late father's legal team. David's stomach tightened. The last thing he wanted to deal with right now was another reminder of his father's death. He'd barely had time to process the loss, let alone deal with the legal aftermath. But something about the subject line caught his eye. Urgent, Caldwell Estate, immediate action required. He frowned and opened the email, his heart pounding in his chest. Attached was a formal letter from the law firm. David quickly scanned the contents, his blood running cold. Dear Mr. Caldwell. Per the stipulations outlined in your father's will, a portion of your shares in Caldwell Enterprises will be transferred to an undisclosed party, effective immediately. This clause was activated upon the completion of specific conditions set forth by your father prior to his passing. Please contact our office for further details. David read the letter again, slower this time. What the hell? How could this have happened without him knowing? His father had been meticulous, controlling every aspect of his life until the very end. But this? Transferring his shares to an undisclosed party? Who could it be? And why? He felt a surge of anger and panic rise in his chest. His company was everything, he had built it from the ground up, sacrificed everything for it. How could it just slip through his fingers like this? David? He looked up to see Emily standing in the doorway of his office. Her eyes were cold, calculating, as if she already knew something was wrong. You've been hiding in here for a while. The guests are starting to wonder. David held up the letter. Did you know about this? Emily didn't move, didn't flinch. Know about what? This, he said, thrusting the letter toward her. My father had some hidden clause in his will. He transferred a portion of my shares to someone I don't even know. Emily's eyes flicked to the paper for a brief moment, then back to David. Her expression was unreadable. That's unfortunate. Unfortunate? David's voice was rising now. This is my company, Emily. Everything I've worked for. And now, it's just slipping away. She took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving his. You think you can keep this up forever? David blinked, caught off guard. What are you talking about? This act, she said, her voice low but sharp. She gestured toward the living room, where the guests were still mingling, oblivious to the storm brewing in the office. The perfect life. The perfect company. The perfect marriage. David stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. What do you mean, perfect marriage? We're fine. Emily laughed softly, but it was a bitter sound. Are we? Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a man who's more married to his company than to his wife. You've been so obsessed with holding on to control, with building your empire, that you haven't even noticed what's slipping away. David felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. He had been so consumed with his work, with building Caldwell Enterprises into a tech giant, that he hadn't seen the cracks forming in his personal life. But still, this wasn't the time for Emily's criticisms. This isn't about us right now, Emily. This is about my father's will, about the company. No, David, she said, setting her wine glass down on his desk. It's about everything. You think you can keep all the plates spinning, but eventually, one of them is going to fall. And when it does, the rest will follow. David didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure what stung more, her words or the fact that she was probably right. But he couldn't deal with this right now. Not with everything else falling apart. I'll fix it, he muttered, more to himself than to her. I'll figure out who's behind this, and I'll fix it. Emily shook her head slightly. You can't control everything, David. Sometimes, things fall apart. She turned and walked out of the office, leaving him standing there, clutching the letter. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring after her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being able to solve any problem that came his way. But now, for the first time, he felt something slipping through his fingers, something he couldn't fix with money or power. David glanced down at the letter again. The words blurred in front of his eyes, but one thing was clear, his world was about to change, and not for the better. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do. Now that the cracks in David's perfect life are starting to show, what do you think lies ahead? Could someone even closer than Emily or Marcus be involved in this plot against him? Let me know your thoughts and theories in the comments, I'd love to hear what you're thinking. And if you're as intrigued as I am by what's coming next, hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated as we dig deeper into David's unraveling world. Don't miss out on the twists that are yet to come. Chapter 2, Digging Deeper. David Caldwell stepped out of the town car, the cool breeze of a Manhattan morning brushing past his face. The towering skyscrapers that usually symbolized his success now felt like a cage closing in on him. As he stood in front of the sleek glass building that housed Donovan Associates, the letter replayed in his mind, its cryptic words pulling him deeper into a spiral of doubt. The revolving doors led him into the polished marble foyer, where every detail screamed wealth and prestige. Donovan's office had been handling his family's legal matters for years. Yet, today, the familiar surroundings felt tainted. How much had the firm hidden from him? What else hadn't he been told? He crossed the vast reception area, the sound of his footsteps echoing, but the silence inside him was heavier. Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Donovan is ready for you, the receptionist said with a polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. David gave a curt nod and made his way to the private office. Donovan's door was slightly ajar, just enough for David to catch a glimpse of the lawyer standing behind his oak desk, thumbing through a folder. David pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. "David," Donovan greeted, offering a hand. His voice was warm, but the underlying tension was impossible to miss. Donovan's smile was the kind reserved for uncomfortable conversations, too friendly, too forced. "Mr. Donovan." David's voice was clipped, and he ignored the handshake, cutting right to the chase. "What's going on? Why wasn't I informed of this transfer of shares? This clause in my father's will?" Donovan hesitated, retreating slightly behind his desk, as if that wooden barrier could shield him from David's growing frustration. "Please, have a seat." David remained standing. His patience was thin, and the weight of the letter in his jacket pocket felt like a ticking time bomb. "David, I understand this must come as a shock," Donovan began, lowering himself into his chair. His eyes flicked to the thick folder that lay open on his desk, filled with papers David hadn't seen before. "A shock?" David repeated, incredulous. "That's one way to put it. You could have warned me. I trusted you." Donovan ran a hand through his thinning hair, his usually unflappable demeanor cracking at the edges. "Your father, he was a man of secrets, Mr. Caldwell." David's jaw tightened. "What kind of secrets?" Donovan looked at him, and for the first time in their years of working together, David saw something in his eyes: hesitation. Fear, perhaps. Or maybe guilt. "The kind that protects something much bigger than just a company," Donovan said softly. The room seemed to shrink as Donovan slid the folder toward him. David's eyes flicked down to it, his heart pounding. He reached for the file with a mix of dread and curiosity, his fingers brushing the cold paper. Donovan's voice broke the silence. "I suggest you start here." David opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. They were old, some yellowed with age. His father's signature adorned each page like a ghost from the past, haunting him. But as he read, none of it made sense. There were instructions, cryptic notes, references to meetings he knew nothing about, and clauses buried in legal jargon that danced around the central point: his control of the company was conditional. "You need to be more specific, Donovan." David's voice held an edge now. "What the hell is this? What kind of personal conditions are we talking about?" Donovan let out a slow breath, as if bracing himself for the next blow. "Your father believed that control of Caldwell Enterprises couldn't simply be handed down, David. He wanted to ensure that his legacy wasn't just preserved, but earned." David's hands tightened on the folder, crinkling the edges of the pages. "I earned everything. I built this company into what it is today. So what does this clause mean? What personal conditions could possibly be enough to strip me of my shares?" Donovan looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. "It's not that simple. Your father. He set certain criteria that had to be met, personal, not professional. He believed that unless those conditions were fulfilled, you wouldn't be ready to truly lead the company." David's temper flared, and he slammed the folder shut, sending an echo through the room. "This is ridiculous. I've been leading this company for years. I've earned my place at the top. Why wasn't I told about this sooner?" "I wasn't at liberty to share that information, David," Donovan said quietly. "Your father's instructions were explicit. You weren't to know until this point." David paced the office, his mind racing. His father had always been controlling, always testing him. But this? This was too far. Who gets the shares if these Conditions aren't met? Donovan hesitated. That's not something I can disclose at this time. David stopped mid-step, his eyes locking onto the lawyer's. What do you mean you can't disclose it? Is the party listed in that folder? It's complicated, Donovan replied, folding his hands in front of him. The person is not an outsider, but that's all I'm permitted to say. David felt his heart skip a beat. Not an outsider. His mind immediately went to his brother, Sam, and a wave of cold dread washed over him. Could his father have handed part of the company to Sam? Or worse? Emily. You can't possibly think I'm going to walk away without knowing who's taking what's mine, David said, voice low, the anger simmering beneath his words. I understand your frustration, Donovan said, his calm voice only stoking the fire in David's chest. But your father's wishes were clear. Until the conditions are met or the time comes for you to make certain decisions, I am bound to his confidentiality. David was silent for a moment, his hand still gripping the folder as if it held all the answers he desperately needed. He stared at Donovan, but the lawyer's expression remained unreadable. My father's legacy is my legacy now, David said through gritted teeth. I'm not going to let some hidden clause destroy everything I've built. Donovan gave a slow nod, his expression softening slightly. I never doubted that, David. But I suggest you take time to consider what your father truly valued, beyond just the company. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and David resisted the urge to lash out further. What his father truly valued. The man had been distant for most of his life, more interested in molding David into his image than showing any real affection. What could he have valued that wasn't tied to business? David stuffed the folder under his arm and moved toward the door, his mind buzzing with questions he couldn't answer. David, Donovan called after him. If I may offer a word of advice. David stopped but didn't turn around. Whatever you uncover from here, tread carefully. The people involved may not be who you expect. David stiffened at the warning, but he didn't reply. Instead, he walked out of the office, his footsteps heavy, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. Chapter 3, Shadows of the Past. David's office was shrouded in the dim glow of his desk lamp, papers and old documents strewn across the surface. The air was thick with dust, stirred up from old files he'd pulled from the depths of his father's personal archives. It had been days since his meeting with Donovan, and David had hardly slept. Every hour he wasn't at work, he was here, digging, searching for answers buried in his father's cryptic past. There was something more, something Donovan hadn't told him outright, but David could sense it between the lawyer's guarded words. His father had been more than just a businessman, more than just the distant figure who had shaped his life from afar. He had secrets. And those secrets were now threatening everything David had built. A thick leather-bound journal sat open on the desk, the pages filled with his father's precise handwriting. David's eyes scanned the words again, though they had begun to blur after hours of staring at them. One particular entry stood out, a note scribbled in the margins of a page detailing a business deal from over 2 decades ago. Trust is everything, but it's also the easiest thing to lose. The phrase gnawed at him. His father had never been the sentimental type, yet here, in his private thoughts, was an emphasis on trust. Was it a warning? A reflection? And why did it feel like the old man had left these breadcrumbs on purpose? David tossed the journal aside, frustration tightening his chest. The pieces weren't fitting together. Not yet. David's next move was inevitable. He had to confront Sam. His younger brother had been distant for years, both figuratively and literally. After their father's death, Sam had retreated even further, holing up in some remote part of upstate New York, living off what little inheritance he'd received. David knew Sam resented him, that the division of their father's estate had driven a wedge between them that neither had been willing to cross. But now, with everything on the line, David couldn't ignore the possibility that Sam was involved in this conspiracy. The drive to Sam's cabin felt interminable. The further north he went, the more isolated the landscape became, until the towering buildings of the city were just a memory, replaced by thick woods and winding roads. Sam's cabin came into view, a modest structure tucked away among the trees. David parked the car, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance, but smoke curled lazily from the chimney. He walked up to the door, hesitating only for a second before knocking. It took a moment, but the door creaked open to reveal Sam standing there, a bottle of whiskey in hand, his face unshaven and his clothes disheveled. "David," Sam said, his voice flat. "Didn't expect to see you here." "We need to talk," David replied, pushing past him into the cabin without waiting for an invitation. The inside was as sparse as David remembered, simple furniture, a fireplace, and stacks of old magazines littered the floor. Sam closed the door and leaned against it, watching his brother with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. "I don't have time for small talk," David said, turning to face him. "I need to know what you know about the shares." "About Dad's will." Sam raised an eyebrow, taking a swig from the bottle. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Sam. Dad had some hidden clause in his will. He transferred part of my company's shares to someone I don't know. I need to know if it's you." Sam laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think I'm involved in this?" "Christ, David, you've always been paranoid, but this takes the cake." David stepped forward, his voice low, threatening. "If you know something, now's the time to tell me. I'm not going to let everything I've built be destroyed by some secret deal." "You've always made it about what you've built," Sam shot back, his voice rising. "You think I give a damn about your company? You're so blinded by your precious empire that you can't see what's right in front of you." David's chest tightened. "What are you saying?" Sam set the bottle down on the table, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in closer. "You think this is about me? About Dad?" David could feel the tension building, his heart pounding in his ears. "Then what is it about?" "You've always been blind, David," Sam said, his voice thick with resentment. "It's not me you should be worried about." David stared at him, every nerve on edge. "Then who?" Sam's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Maybe you should start looking a little closer to home." David felt his stomach drop. Closer to home? What the hell does that mean? But Sam didn't elaborate. He just shrugged, picking up the bottle again and retreating to the couch, his eyes never leaving David's. The drive back to the city was filled with silence, broken only by the steady hum of the car's engine. Sam's words echoed in David's mind, unraveling his thoughts, planting seeds of doubt in every corner of his consciousness. Look closer to home. What did that mean? Was Sam implying Emily? Claire? Someone else in the company? His mind raced through every possibility, every conversation he'd had in the past few months. Emily had been acting strange, yes, but their relationship had always been strained. It didn't mean she was capable of something like this, did it? By the time David reached the city, his chest was tight with anxiety. The office was empty when he arrived, late enough that most of the employees had gone home. He made his way to his private floor, the quiet hum of the building systems the only sound to greet him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone was always one step ahead of him. Sam's cryptic warning had burrowed deep into his psyche, and now everything, everyone, felt like a threat. Later that night, as he sifted through more of his father's documents, David found something unexpected, a letter, buried in the back of an old file. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's, though the ink had faded with time. It wasn't a business document. It was personal. David. If you're reading this, it means things have come to pass as I feared they might. I know you've worked hard to build Caldwell Enterprises into what it is today, and I'm proud of you for that. But there are things I've kept from you, things I couldn't tell you while I was alive. This company is more than just a business, it's a legacy. And sometimes, protecting that legacy means making difficult choices. Trust is the foundation of everything, and if you lose it, you lose everything. Be careful who you trust, David. The answers you're looking for are closer than you think. The letter ended abruptly, leaving David with more questions than answers. What had his father been trying to protect? And who had betrayed that trust? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the letter, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. For the first time, he felt a pang of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, fear. Chapter 4, The Hidden Hand. David sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen, frustration gnawing at him. His father's cryptic note, the warning from Sam, and now this, financial discrepancies that were slowly unraveling everything he had built. For the past few days, he had been poring over financial records, searching for answers, and each new discovery only seemed to confirm his worst fears. Withdrawals that didn't make sense. Transfers to unknown accounts. Missing contracts. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents, it was systematic. Someone was siphoning money from his company, and they had been doing it for months, if not longer. He clenched his fists, the weight of betrayal pressing down on his chest. Whoever was behind this had been smart, careful, but not careful enough. With the help of his assistant, Claire, he had managed to trace the anomalies back to someone in the company's inner circle, Marcus, his CFO. The man he had trusted with the company's finances for years. David stood abruptly, grabbing the folder of evidence from his desk. He wasn't going to let this go any further. He stormed out of his office, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway as he made his way to Marcus's office. The door to Marcus's office was slightly ajar when David arrived. He didn't bother knocking. Instead, he pushed it open, stepping into the room with the kind of intensity that immediately set the tone. Marcus looked up from his desk, his expression calm, unbothered. David. I wasn't expecting you. Cut the bullshit, Marcus. David's voice was sharp, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. He slammed it down on the desk in front of Marcus, making the papers inside scatter slightly. Explain this. Marcus raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the folder without touching it. Explain what? You know damn well what, David growled. The missing money. The unexplained transfers. Don't act like you're in the dark. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms casually over his chest. I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific. I handle a lot of transactions for the company. David's patience snapped. Enough games, Marcus. I've traced everything back to you. You've been stealing from the company. Marcus was silent for a moment, his eyes flicking to the papers before slowly meeting David's gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful. Stealing is a strong word, David. David took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. Don't try to downplay this. You've been siphoning money out of the company right under my nose. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Marcus's expression didn't change, his calm demeanor only serving to enrage David further. I think, Marcus said slowly, that there's more to this than you realize. David's chest tightened. What are you talking about? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. You know, David, loyalty is a funny thing. It's only as strong as the foundation it's built on. And if you ask me, you've been standing on some shaky ground for a while. David felt a cold chill run down his spine. There was something in Marcus's voice, something unsettling. He had expected a confrontation, a denial, maybe even an excuse. But this felt like something else entirely. What the hell are you talking about? David demanded, his voice harsh. Marcus gave a slow smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Maybe it's time you start looking at who's standing beside you. Not just at work. David's heart skipped a beat. Emily. Was Marcus implying that she was involved? It didn't make sense. She couldn't be a part of this. But Sam's warning echoed in his mind, and now Marcus was feeding the same suspicion. Are you saying Emily is involved? David asked, his voice low, dangerous. I'm not saying anything. Marcus shrugged, sitting back in his chair again. But I wouldn't be so quick to assume that everyone around you has your best interests at heart. David's stomach churned, the weight of the accusation sinking in. He had always trusted Emily, or, at least, he had tried to. But lately, things had been different. She had been distant, cold, and more secretive than usual. Was it possible that she had been hiding more than just her discontent? David's mind raced. The missing money. The hidden clause in his father's will. And now this, his wife, possibly conspiring against him with his trusted CFO. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his life, David felt truly cornered. Leaving Marcus's office, David felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had only given him a glimpse of the truth. There was something more, something bigger at play, but he couldn't quite grasp it yet. He returned to his own office, slamming the door behind him as he tried to process everything. His mind raced through the possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. If Emily was involved, if she had been working with Marcus to undermine him, what else had she been hiding? David sat at his desk, staring at the blank computer screen in front of him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought back to the last few months, to the way Emily had been acting. The distance, the late nights out, the vague excuses. At the time, he had chalked it up to their strained marriage, to the growing emotional rift between them. But now, with everything he knew, it felt like more than just a troubled relationship. It felt like betrayal. The thought of Emily being involved in something like this made David sick to his stomach. He had married her because he believed in her, because, despite their differences, he trusted her. But now, that trust felt like it had been built on nothing more than a lie. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to steady his breathing. He needed to be sure before he confronted her. He needed more than just Marcus's insinuations. If he was going to accuse his wife of betrayal, he needed proof. Later that evening, David called Claire into his office. She had been his assistant for years, loyal and hardworking, and right now, she was the only person he felt he could trust. If anyone could help him figure out what was really going on, it was her. "Claire, I need your help," David said as she sat down across from him. "Of course," she replied, her brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on?" David hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to tell her. But he didn't have time to play it safe. "Not anymore. I think someone's been stealing from the company. I've traced the discrepancies to Marcus, but there's more to it than that. He's implying that Emily might be involved." Claire's eyes widened in shock. Emily. Are you sure? I don't know, David admitted, leaning forward. But Marcus seemed pretty confident. I can't just ignore this, Claire. I need to know the truth. Claire nodded, her expression serious. What do you want me to do? I need you to dig deeper, David said. Go through everything, emails, financial records, anything that could point to who's really behind this. And, keep an eye on Emily. Discreetly. Claire's face softened with empathy, but she nodded. I'll do whatever it takes, David. David watched as she left the office, feeling a mix of relief and dread. He didn't want to believe that his wife could betray him, but he couldn't afford to be naive. Not anymore. The stakes were too high, and the ground beneath him was too unstable. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through everything that had happened. Emily lay beside him, her breathing steady and calm, but David couldn't help but wonder what was going on behind those closed eyes. Was she really capable of betraying him? Was Marcus right? He glanced over at her, her face peaceful in the dim light of the room. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to ask her what was really going on. But the words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to know the answer, not yet. Instead, he turned away, staring at the darkness outside the window. The city skyline blinked back at him, indifferent to his turmoil. He had built this life, this empire, but now it felt like it was crumbling around him. And the worst part was, he didn't know who he could trust anymore. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The only thing that filled his mind was Marcus's words, playing over and over like a broken record. Maybe it's time you start looking at who's standing beside you. Chapter 5, The Betrayal. David had always prided himself on his ability to read people. It was a skill that had made him a titan in the business world, a quality that kept him steps ahead of competitors, partners, and adversaries alike. But as he stared at the email Claire had just sent him, the cold truth sunk in: he had been blind. The email was short, clinical, just a few lines from Claire confirming the worst. Emily's name was attached to several accounts, cleverly disguised behind shell corporations. She had been siphoning money from Caldwell Enterprises for months, maybe longer. But it wasn't just the money. It was the partnership, the alliance with Marcus, the one person in the company David had trusted implicitly. The betrayal cut deeper than any business deal gone wrong. Emily, the woman he had built his life with, had been conspiring behind his back to steal what they had built together. He had given her everything, his love, his trust, his name, and she had used it all to betray him. David sat at his desk, the weight of the discovery pressing down on his chest. He could feel the walls of his office closing in, the air growing thick and heavy. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All he could do was sit there, staring at the email, wondering how he had missed the signs. How had he let it get this far? David had never felt more prepared for war than when he walked into the penthouse that evening. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out the quiet sounds of the city below. He had spent the drive home going over every word he wanted to say, every accusation he would throw at her. But now, standing in the doorway, all he felt was cold rage. Emily was sitting at the marble kitchen island, a glass of wine in her hand, casually scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up when he entered, didn't acknowledge his presence. It was as if she didn't have a care in the world, as if she hadn't just been caught red-handed. Emily. She finally glanced up, her expression neutral. David. You're home early. The calm in her voice was infuriating. How could she act so normal, so composed, when everything was crumbling around them? When she had set fire to everything they had built? David walked toward her, his movements stiff, the tension in his body visible in every step. He set the printed email down on the counter in front of her, his eyes locked onto hers. "Explain this." Emily raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the paper as though it were nothing more than an inconvenience. She set her wine glass down and folded the email open, her face betraying no emotion. After a moment, she let out a sigh, folding the paper neatly and sliding it back toward him. "So, you found out." David's breath caught in his throat. He had expected denials, excuses, anything but this blatant indifference. "That's all you have to say?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You're not even going to deny it?" Emily stood, walking past him to the window, her movements slow and deliberate. "Why would I deny it? You've already made up your mind. You're just here to hear the confirmation." David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. She wasn't even trying to defend herself, wasn't even pretending to care. The calmness in her voice, the casual way she admitted her betrayal, made his blood boil. "Did you really think I wasn't going to find out?" David's voice cracked slightly, his emotions slipping through the carefully maintained facade. "You've been stealing from me, stealing from the company." "And for what, Emily? What the hell were you thinking?" Emily turned to face him, her expression as cold as ice. "What was I thinking? I was thinking that I'm done living in your shadow, David. I'm done playing the role of the supportive wife while you get to be the all-powerful CEO." David stared at her, his chest tight with anger. "You did this because of some insecurity? Because you felt trapped?" Emily's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Trapped? You think this is about insecurity? I've spent the last 10 years watching you control everything, our lives, our marriage, your precious company. And all the while, I've been nothing more than an accessory to you. You never once asked me what I wanted. What I needed." David's mind spun. He had never thought of her that way, had never believed she felt so suffocated by their life together. But this wasn't about feelings, this was betrayal. Pure and simple. "You think stealing from me is going to make things better," he snapped. "You think conspiring with Marcus, of all people, is going to solve your problems?" Emily's lips curled into a faint smile, one that sent chills down David's spine. "I didn't just steal from you, David. I took control. I built something for myself, something real, something powerful. And you had no idea." David felt his heart hammering in his chest, each word from her mouth driving the knife deeper. "You destroyed everything, Emily." "No, David," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "You destroyed us. A long time ago." The argument escalated, voices rising and falling like the tide as David and Emily hurled accusations at each other. Every word cut deeper than the last, each accusation tearing apart whatever remnants of their marriage had remained. David paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, trying to keep his thoughts together. His world was unraveling, and he had no control over it. Emily had taken that from him. She had stripped him of the one thing he thought he had left, his power, his control. "I trusted you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I trusted you with everything." Emily crossed her arms, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "And that was your first mistake. Trusting me. Trusting anyone." David turned toward her, his heart pounding. "Why? Why would you do this?" Emily's face softened for just a moment, a flash of something unreadable crossing her features. "Because I needed to be free, David. I needed to take control of my life, of my destiny. And if that meant taking from you, then so be it." David felt the weight of her words crush him. For so long, he had believed that their marriage was a partnership, that they were building something together. But now, he saw the truth. Emily had never been his partner. She had always been playing her own game, and he had been too blind to see it. "You had everything," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why wasn't that enough?" Emily's expression hardened again. "Because I didn't want what you were offering. I wanted something more." David closed his eyes, the reality of her betrayal sinking in. Everything he had built, his company, his marriage, his life, had been a lie. And now, it was falling apart around him. After Emily left the room, David stood alone in the penthouse, the silence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. He walked over to the large windows that overlooked the city, his reflection barely visible in the glass. The man who stared back at him was a stranger. The rage that had filled him earlier had burned out, leaving behind only numbness. The betrayal, the lies, the loss, it was too much. He had been fighting for so long, trying to hold on to everything that mattered, but now it felt like there was nothing left to fight for. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to deal with the outside world. All he wanted was to forget, to escape the crushing weight of everything that had happened. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, downing it in one go before pouring another. The burn of the alcohol did little to dull the pain, but he kept drinking, hoping for some kind of release. As the hours passed, David found himself sinking deeper into despair. The world felt distant, cold. The company he had built was slipping away, and now his marriage was in ruins. What was left for him? What was the point of it all? He staggered to the couch, his vision blurring as the alcohol took hold. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the thoughts, the memories, the pain. But even in the darkness, he couldn't escape. Emily's voice echoed in his mind, her words cutting deeper than any physical wound ever could. "You destroyed us." David sat in the suffocating silence, feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his life. The weight of the betrayal was too much. He had lost everything, his company, his wife, his purpose. And now, he didn't know how to find his way back. Chapter 6, Shattered. David woke to the sound of the city humming outside his window. The sun had barely risen, casting a dull, gray light across the penthouse. His head pounded, a dull throb from the whiskey he'd downed the night before, but it wasn't the hangover that crushed him. It was the weight of everything that had happened. Emily's betrayal, Marcus's scheming, his company slipping through his fingers, it all closed in on him like a vice, and he felt completely and utterly shattered. He sat up on the couch, the remnants of last night's empty glass still on the table. The silence in the penthouse felt oppressive, thick with everything unsaid, unresolved. He reached for his phone, but he stopped himself before calling Claire. What was the point? His life, his career, his marriage, it was all gone. For a few minutes, David just sat there, staring blankly at the skyline outside the window. The empire he built felt like a distant memory, a facade that had crumbled in an instant. What now? He thought. What was left for him? The sharp ring of his phone pulled him out of the fog, and David glanced down at the screen. It was Claire. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the decline button, but something in him, some small shred of will, made him answer. "David?" Claire's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. "Can we meet? I need to talk to you." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "Claire, I don't know if I found something," she interrupted, her voice steady but firm. "Something important. Please, just meet with me." David wanted to refuse, to bury himself in his own misery, but Claire had never led him wrong. If there was anyone left he could trust, it was her. An hour later, he was sitting in his office, the faint smell of coffee filling the room as Claire walked in. She looked more tired than usual, dark circles under her eyes, but her expression was resolute. She carried a stack of documents under her arm, and David's stomach churned. He wasn't sure he could handle more bad news. She set the papers down on his desk and took a seat across from him, her eyes softening as they met his. "I know this has been a lot, David. And I know you feel like you've lost everything. But you haven't. Not yet." David shook his head, staring out at the window behind her. "And what exactly do I have left?" Claire leaned forward, her voice steady and full of conviction. "You have me. And you have the truth." Claire spread the documents across his desk, pointing to a series of financial records, emails, and transaction histories that David hadn't seen before. She explained how Marcus and Emily had been funneling money through multiple shell companies, siphoning funds from Caldwell Enterprises into their own accounts. It was a complex web of deceit, meticulously crafted to avoid detection. But Claire, with her deep knowledge of the company's inner workings, had managed to uncover the threads they hadn't fully buried. David stared at the evidence, a strange mix of emotions surging through him. Anger, betrayal, and, beneath it all, a flicker of hope. If Claire had found this, if she had uncovered their scheme, maybe he wasn't as powerless as he thought. "How did I miss this?" David muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "You didn't miss it," Claire said softly. "They worked hard to make sure you didn't see it. But now we know. And we can do something about it." David rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. "I don't even know where to start." Claire reached across the desk, placing her hand on top of his. "We start by taking back what's yours. You've been hit hard, David, but you're not out yet." David looked up at her, the weight of her words settling in. For the first time in days, he felt something besides despair. He felt a spark of defiance, a determination to fight back. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Claire worked tirelessly, digging through more records, connecting the dots, and helping David formulate a plan to regain control of Caldwell Enterprises. Together, they mapped out a strategy to expose Marcus and Emily's conspiracy, gathering enough evidence to confront the board and reclaim his position. As they worked late into the night, David found himself relying on Claire more than ever. She had always been his rock, his trusted confidant, but now, their partnership deepened into something more. She wasn't just his assistant, she was his ally, the one person who hadn't betrayed him. "You've always known this company better than anyone," David said one evening, leaning back in his chair as they sifted through the last of the records. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Claire smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You're stronger than you think, David. You just needed someone to remind you." David nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for her. But beneath that gratitude, there was something else, something that made him feel alive again, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Trust. He could trust her. And right now, that meant everything. Despite their progress, the betrayal still haunted David. Late at night, after hours of working with Claire, he would sit alone in his office, staring at the shadows on the wall. Emily's voice echoed in his mind, the sharpness of her words cutting deep into his soul. He couldn't shake the image of her standing in their penthouse, calmly admitting her betrayal as if it meant nothing. "You destroyed us." The memory of those words haunted him, kept him awake long after the city outside had gone quiet. Had he really been so blind? So wrapped up in his ambition, in his quest for control, that he hadn't seen the cracks forming in his life, in his marriage. David had always prided himself on being in control, on being the master of his destiny. But now, as he sat in the darkness, he realized how fragile that control had been. Emily had taken it from him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. But Claire's words echoed just as loudly, "You have me. And you have the truth." David clung to that truth, the only solid ground he had left. Emily may have torn apart his life, but she hadn't destroyed him completely. He still had something to fight for. As the days turned into weeks, David and Claire made steady progress. They uncovered more of Marcus and Emily's plot, piecing together a damning case against them. The more they uncovered, the more David realized just how deep the conspiracy went. Marcus had been manipulating the company's finances for years, with Emily's help, slowly bleeding Caldwell Enterprises dry. But now, David had the upper hand. With Claire's help, he had gathered enough evidence to not only confront Marcus and Emily but to expose them to the board, to the shareholders, and to the world. It was time to take back what was his. One night, as they sat in the office going over the final details of their plan, David turned to Claire, his expression serious. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said quietly. Claire smiled, her eyes soft. "You would have found a way." David shook his head. "No. I wouldn't have. You've been my lifeline through all of this. And I don't just mean the company." Claire held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. For a moment, the weight of everything else faded, and it was just the two of them, sitting in the quiet stillness of the office. David felt something stir inside him, something that had been buried under the rubble of his shattered life. "Whatever happens next," Claire said softly, "we'll face it together." David nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over him. Together. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He wasn't fighting this battle by himself anymore. The day finally came when David was ready to confront Marcus and Emily. With Claire by his side, he walked into the boardroom, armed with the evidence they had gathered. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his expression smug and confident, while Emily sat beside him, her face unreadable. David stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been working toward, the moment where he would reclaim his life, his company, his control. As he laid out the evidence, the room grew quieter and quieter, the weight of the truth sinking in. Marcus's smug smile faded, replaced by a look of panic. Emily's calm facade cracked, her eyes narrowing as she realized the walls were closing in. When David finished, the room was silent. He turned to face Marcus and Emily, his voice steady. "This ends now," he said. "You thought you could take everything from me, but you were wrong. You've been exposed, and now you'll face the consequences." Marcus stood, his face red with anger, but before he could say a word, the board members began murmuring, their eyes filled with shock and disgust. The tide had turned. David had won. Chapter 7, The Revelation. David sat in his office, the weight of his father's final words echoing in his mind. The battle with Marcus and Emily had shaken him to his core, but what Claire had just revealed was far worse. The folder in front of him held a letter written in his father's distinctive handwriting, its contents more shocking than anything David could have imagined. His father had anticipated everything, the betrayal, the downfall of the company, even David's eventual loss of control. And yet, he had left behind a solution, hidden away in a secret account. There were resources there, enough to rebuild Caldwell Enterprises from the ashes. But there was a catch, one that made David's stomach churn. To access these resources, David had to relinquish full control of the company. His hands tightened around the edges of the letter, his mind reeling. After everything he had fought for, everything he had built, was he really willing to let it go? Claire sat across from David, her expression serious yet gentle. She had been the one to discover the hidden account, buried deep in the labyrinth of his father's financial empire. It was a lifeline, a way out of the wreckage that Marcus and Emily had left behind. But it came with a steep price. Your father always knew you'd be tested, David, Claire said softly, her eyes full of empathy. She placed a small, worn key on the desk between them, the key to the account. The question is, are you willing to sacrifice the one thing you've spent your whole life holding on to? David's jaw clenched as he stared at the key, his emotions swirling. He knew this would happen, he muttered, more to himself than to Claire. He planned for it. Claire nodded. He didn't trust Marcus. He probably didn't even trust Emily. But he trusted you to make the right decision when the time came. David felt his chest tighten. His father had always been a shadow over his life, a distant, controlling figure who had shaped him into the man he was today. But this was something different. This was his father giving him a choice, but it was a choice that felt impossible. You don't have to decide now, Claire said quietly. But the resources are there, waiting. If you choose to use them, you'll have everything you need to start over. David shook his head, staring at the skyline beyond the window. Start over, he said bitterly. How do I start over when everything I've worked for is slipping through my fingers? Claire's voice was soft but firm. You still have the truth, David. And that's more than most people ever get. For days, David wrestled with the decision. The company had been his life's work, the legacy his father had left him. But now, that legacy felt more like a burden than a gift. His father had set this in motion, leaving him with a path forward, but only if David was willing to give up the one thing he had fought so hard to protect, control. The more David thought about it, the more the truth became inescapable. He had spent his entire life chasing power, control, and success. And in doing so, he had lost everything else, his marriage, his relationships, his sense of self. The company had become his identity, and now, to save it, he had to let it go. Late one night, as David sat alone in the penthouse, the decision crystallized in his mind. His father had always believed in sacrifice for the greater good, and now David understood that this was his moment. It wasn't about holding on to power. It was about doing what was right, about rebuilding something stronger from the ruins. He picked up the key from the desk, turning it over in his hands. The weight of it felt heavy, but not as heavy as the decision he had just made. The boardroom was filled with tension as David walked in, the key tucked away in his jacket pocket. Marcus and Emily were already seated, their expressions a mix of smugness and defiance. They thought they had won, that David had been beaten down by the weight of their betrayal. But they were wrong. David took his place at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the faces of the board members. This was his moment, the moment to reveal everything, to take back what was his. But not in the way Marcus and Emily expected. I've spent my entire life building this company, David began, his voice steady but firm. I built Caldwell Enterprises from the ground up, and I fought to protect it from anyone who tried to tear it down. He glanced at Marcus, who smirked, clearly enjoying what he thought was David's last desperate stand. But David continued, undeterred. And along the way, I made sacrifices. Some that I'm proud of, and some that I'm not. But today, I'm going to make one final sacrifice. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his smugness fading slightly as he sensed something shifting in the room. David reached into his jacket and pulled out the key, holding it up for the room to see. This key represents a decision I've made. My father left me a choice, a way to rebuild this company after the damage you two have done. Marcus's eyes widened, and Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. But in order to access the resources he left behind, I have to relinquish control of the company, David said, his gaze locking onto Marcus and Emily. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. A stunned silence filled the room. Marcus's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by confusion and disbelief. David stood tall, his voice clear and unwavering. You think you've won because you took what you could from me. But what you don't realize is that this company, this legacy, is bigger than you. It's bigger than me. And I'm not going to let you destroy it. He turned to the board, meeting each member's gaze. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Caldwell Enterprises. A murmur spread through the room, shock and disbelief rippling across the faces of the board members. Marcus's face turned red with anger, but David didn't give him a chance to speak. I'm appointing Claire as interim CEO, David continued, his voice strong. She's the one who uncovered the truth, and she's the one who can lead this company into the future. Claire, seated at the far end of the table, looked stunned but grateful. David met her gaze, giving her a small nod. She had been his rock, his ally through all of this, and now she was the one who would take the reins. You can't do this, Marcus spat, finally finding his voice. You don't have the authority. I have the authority to protect this company from people like you, David interrupted, his voice cold. And that's exactly what I'm doing. Emily's face had gone pale, her hands clenched in her lap. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. David looked at her, the woman who had once been his partner, his wife, and felt a strange sense of peace. He had let go of the anger, the bitterness. Now, all that remained was the truth. She had made her choice, and now he had made his. This isn't about power anymore, David said softly, his eyes never leaving Emily's. It's about doing what's right. The board meeting ended in chaos, but David didn't stick around to watch the fallout. He had done what he came to do. As he left the building, the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long seemed to lift. He had sacrificed control, but in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable, freedom. Claire caught up to him as he stepped outside, her face a mix of relief and disbelief. David, she said, breathless. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, David replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. You're the one who's going to fix this company now. Claire shook her head, her eyes softening. I wouldn't have been able to do any of this without you. David turned to face her, his expression serious. You're going to do great things, Claire. I know it. She looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. What about you? She asked quietly. What are you going to do now? David gazed out at the city, the lights twinkling in the distance. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have a plan, didn't have an empire to run or a company to manage. And yet, he felt lighter than he had in years. I don't know, he admitted, a hint of a smile on his lips. But I think I'm ready to find out. Chapter 8, Redemption. The sun was setting over the city as David stood on the balcony, the wind gently rustling his shirt as he leaned against the railing. The city stretched out before him, a sprawling landscape of opportunity, ambition, and power. For so long, this view had represented everything he had worked for, Caldwell Enterprises, his empire, his legacy. But now, as the warm hues of twilight bathed the skyline, he saw it differently. David had given up control of his company, but instead of feeling the crushing weight of loss, he felt something else: peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't driven by the insatiable need to prove himself, to cling to power, to stay one step ahead of everyone else. He had let go, and in doing so, he had found something more valuable than the company he had spent his life building: freedom. The final board meeting had played out exactly as David had planned. Marcus had tried to argue, to fight back, but the evidence was overwhelming. Claire had exposed every layer of the conspiracy, and the board had unanimously sided with David. Marcus's face had gone from defiant to panicked in a matter of minutes, while Emily had sat silently beside him, her expression unreadable. David hadn't lingered to watch the aftermath. As soon as the vote was cast, and Claire was appointed the new CEO, David had stood up, thanked the board, and walked out of the room. He didn't need to see Marcus and Emily's downfall. Their betrayal had already cost him so much: his trust, his marriage, his peace of mind, but he wasn't going to let it cost him his future. As he left the boardroom for the last time, David felt lighter. The company was no longer his, but the burden of holding on to it had lifted. He had made peace with his decision, and now it was time to step into the next chapter of his life. Later that evening, David found himself standing outside Sam's apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. They hadn't spoken since their last confrontation, but something had changed in David. He realized that part of his journey toward redemption involved mending the relationships he had neglected, and Sam was at the top of that list. He knocked on the door, his palms sweating slightly as he waited. For a moment, he thought Sam might not answer. But then, the door swung open, revealing his younger brother, who looked surprised to see him. "David?" Sam said, his voice tinged with confusion. "Hey, Sam." David smiled, feeling the weight of their shared history in the air between them. "Can we talk?" Sam hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing David to enter. The apartment was modest, a far cry from the luxury David was used to, but it was cozy and full of life in a way that his sterile penthouse had never been. There were books stacked on the coffee table, an old guitar leaning against the wall, and the faint smell of dinner still lingered in the air. They sat across from each other in the small living room, the tension thick but not insurmountable. For a few moments, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with the things they hadn't said over the years. "I owe you an apology," David said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. "I've been selfish, Sam. I've spent so much time focused on the company, on proving myself, that I forgot about the people who really mattered." Sam looked at him, his expression unreadable at first. But then, he nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I didn't make it easy," he admitted. "I was angry at you. I was angry at Dad. But most of all, I was angry at myself for not being able to let it go." David felt a lump form in his throat. "I should have been there for you. After Dad died, after everything. I should have reached out. But I was too caught up in my own world." Sam smiled faintly, the tension between them starting to ease. "We've both made mistakes, David. But that doesn't mean we can't fix things." David nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "I want to fix things, Sam. I want to start over." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the weight of the past slowly lifting. David realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't focused on the future or the past. He was just present, sitting with his brother, reconnecting in a way he hadn't allowed himself to in years. A few hours later, David and Sam stood on the small balcony outside the apartment, the cool evening breeze rustling their clothes. The city stretched out before them, alive with lights and movement, but for once, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt hopeful. You did it, Sam said quietly, glancing at David out of the corner of his eye. David chuckled softly, shaking his head. No, we did it. Sam smiled, leaning against the railing as he looked out at the skyline. So, what's next for you? Now that you've stepped down. David sighed, the question lingering in the air. For so long, his identity had been tied to Caldwell Enterprises, to the company his father had built and that he had grown. But now, with that chapter of his life closed, he wasn't sure what came next. I don't know, David admitted, his voice thoughtful. But for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with not knowing. I think I just want to take things one day at a time for a while. Sam nodded, understanding. That sounds like a good plan. David smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The company may have been a part of his life for so long, but it wasn't his entire life. There was more to him than just Caldwell Enterprises, more to his story than the pursuit of power and control. And now, he had the chance to discover what that was. I want to focus on the things that really matter, David said, his voice quiet but resolute. Family. Relationships. Things that last. Sam clapped him on the shoulder, a grin spreading across his face. Well, you've got a brother who could use a little more attention these days. David laughed, the sound light and free. I think I can make that happen. As the night deepened and the city quieted, David felt something shift inside him. The man who had once been consumed by ambition and the need for control was gone. In his place was someone who had been through the fire and come out the other side, tempered by loss but also renewed by the promise of something better. David had sacrificed his company, his power, but in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable, his freedom, his integrity, and the chance to rebuild his life on a foundation of trust and connection. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. As he and Sam stood together on the balcony, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance, David knew that this was just the beginning. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. What a journey it's been for David. From power and betrayal to redemption and hope, his story has taken some unexpected turns. How did you feel about his ultimate decision to let go of control? Would you have made the same choice, or would you have held on to Caldwell Enterprises at all costs? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the twists and turns of this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. I can't wait to hear your thoughts and what you'd love to see next.